In this lecture, I want to talk about responsibility a little bit. Now, contemporary debates about welfare or corporate bailouts often center on a trade-off between meeting a need and holding people responsible for their behavior. The theory is that any set of institutions that legally commits itself to meeting needs also sets up a perverse incentive system. The logic is encapsulated by sentences like this: if you're going to take care of me, or my kids, my safety, my parents, my health, then I don't have to as much, right? Or, what happens if I don't take care of this? You will? Oh, okay, then I won't. There's a political science term for policies that set up an incentive for individuals not to guard against risk when they're protected from its consequences. You might have come across it before. The term is moral hazard. Now, Schmidtz has a different term for it in the piece you read. He calls it externalized responsibility, but they amount to the same thing. Examples of this might include banks that take on too much risk when they think they are protected from losses associated with risk-taking. So the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, insures all banks, well, more specifically depositors at banks, for the losses that the bank might incur with their money. What that means is that banks are able to afford to take more risk, knowing that they and their depositors are going to be somewhat protected. Another example that's often brought up is the single mothers on welfare who at one point in time chose not to marry. This is before welfare reform in 1996. This incentive doesn't exist anymore, but they were choosing not to marry or even have more children when subsidies for single mothers in poverty are available through FDIC, Aid for Families with Dependent Children. These are examples of moral hazard. They're examples of externalized responsibility. If someone else is going to foot the bill, then I'm going to take more risk than I should, and I'm not going to pay as much attention to the consequences. Now, this idea of taking care of people, having bad incentives, is a concept that's employed both by the left and the right when it suits them. When it comes to analyzing banking institutions and corporations and limited liability rules, left-wing thinkers are all about moral hazard, and when it comes to analyzing the fate of poor African Americans in the inner city, right-wing thinkers are all about moral hazard. It's not really inherently a left or right-wing concept. You just have to believe that people have a fairly self-interested view, or people are fairly self-interested, and you have to believe that people respond to the distribution of incentives that they face. Now, to further explore the trade-off between responsibility and meeting needs, we have to have a sense of what we mean by responsibility. If we were in class right now, I would have a handout for you, but for now you can follow the slides. There's many different senses in which one could be responsible, and I'm going to go through these different senses because we often, when we're talking, tend to confuse these different senses and roll them up into one word, responsibility, whereas in fact there's different meanings here. So one simple way we talk about responsibility is as causal responsibility. So if we say that without A, B would not have happened, or because of A, B would happen, then we're talking about causal responsibility. Without Hitler's parents, of course, there was no Hitler. So in that sense, Hitler's parents are responsible for Hitler. Without Jack's mean words, Jill would not have wept, right? Jack is responsible in a causal sense for Jill's crying. That sense of causal responsibility is often strongly associated with a sense of moral responsibility. Moral responsibility can be added to causal responsibility when people bring about an act with the right sorts of motivations or intentions. So for example, we can say X caused Y, and often we mean therefore X is responsible for Y. So if we say that jerk in the sports car blew through a stoplight and was responsible for the accident, right? We're saying that the jerk caused the accident, but we're also saying the jerk is morally responsible for the accident. It was his fault, right? So when we go from cause to moral responsibility, we're adding this notion of fault. You caused this to happen, and it's your fault, right? We can say the Big Bang caused human history, right? Without saying the Big Bang was responsible for human history, right? If everything starts with the Big Bang in some sense, then without the Big Bang, nothing happened, right? Or for those who are theists, without God, none of this happens. But God may be causally responsible for a lot that's going on, but God is not necessarily morally responsible any more than the Big Bang for what you did last night. No, I tell my students this all the time. If they chose to play Xbox rather than study for the exam, they can be held responsible. They were the cause of their bad exam, and they were also responsible for their bad exam. So far, nothing controversial. Now, sometimes it gets a little more controversial, but I think it's still pretty plausible that we can have moral responsibility without causal connection. So sometimes A's moral responsibility for X is completely independent of whether A caused X or not. So for instance, as a professor, I am responsible for the state I leave my classroom in. Even if I don't make the mess, I might be responsible for the cleanup. It will certainly be true for the janitors who come by in the evening that they are responsible for cleaning the classroom, even though in no way did they take part in causing the mess that they had to clean up. So in many cases, people get held responsible for an outcome even when they're not causally responsible. As parents, you are held responsible for the behavior of your children. As teachers, you are held responsible for the learning of your students. Politicians are often held responsible for outcomes in society that they cannot control. Pet owners are responsible for their pets. Homeowners are responsible for the trees in their backyard that fall on their neighbors' houses. CEOs are responsible to their shareholders. Coaches are responsible for their players, and so on and so forth. Responsibilities are assigned to them, but they don't have complete control, or sometimes any control, over the outcomes that they're being held responsible for. And that's normal. It's just a different sense of moral responsibility, where causal connections just don't exist or are much weaker. Holding people responsible is a way of making outcomes someone's problem. And this is very useful when causal responsibility is hard to assign, sometimes just not clear who caused the mess, right? But it's still the case that the mess needs to be cleaned up, and so we have a question about who gets to clean it up. There are also going to be cases when the people who are causally responsible for the mess are incapable or unwilling to take responsibility. In the case of children, we might say they're just not capable sometimes of taking responsibility. In the case of certain categories of the poor, perhaps they're unwilling in some cases to take responsibility for their situation. In some cases of the poor, it's that they're just unable, right? If there's a disability involved, for instance, you're just unable to take responsibility. So these things create bad outcomes. It might still be better if someone were held responsible for these bad outcomes. And it's an open question who we hold responsible in any given situation. Now, of course, when we hold people responsible for outcomes they can't control sometimes, that internalizes responsibilities in ways that may not always strictly be fair. The justification is not the fairness, but the good consequences of assigning responsibilities in a particular way. Assigning a certain distribution of responsibilities produce better consequences than assigning them in some other way. So Schmidtz is, at some point in time, says that we are responsible for our own welfare, right? What does that mean? Well, what it definitely doesn't mean is that we're causally responsible for everything that happens in our lives and our fates, right? It's entirely possible that our fates are completely out of our control, or at least in a large degree out of our control, right? If the economy goes into the tank and I can't find a job, it's not because I'm underqualified. It's because there are very few jobs out there. What he is saying is that societies work better when people believe themselves to be morally responsible for their problems. Morally responsible in the sense not that they're guilt-ridden because they caused their problems, but morally responsible in the sense that they understand that it's their job to fix it. Right? And he thinks that if people internalize responsibility in that way and accept the responsibility of fixing their own lives, things go better than when people try to foist that responsibility for fixing their lives onto other people. That's the case he's making. I'm not saying he's right. I'm saying that's what he's trying to say. about responsibility. So Schmitz's view is that moral hazard is important. When you make things other people's problem, when you make problems, when you make your messes, particularly other people's problem, that's an important feature of our lives, and it's potentially a bad thing. And that when moral hazard exists, that importantly limits the ways in which we ought to directly attempt to meet needs. He notes that this is especially true if we look at the long run. People's needs are more likely to be met if individuals or families see themselves as responsible for their own lives, he thinks. Taking responsibility is sometimes important even when you don't have complete control over outcomes. So what he's saying at the end of the day is that we sometimes ought to assign responsibilities by looking forwards at how events are likely to play out if we distribute responsibilities in a particular way, and not by looking backwards at whose fault it was.